About another, well, it's about 1:30. Okay.
Maureen, have you paused the screen sharing? There we go.
Well, we're admitting.
There we go.
Okay. There's a few latecomers. Got 28 out of 42, so that's pretty good.
Not bad. Yeah.
All right, I will start with my announcement
ready
so
whenever
Tom
you
can
are.
get started pretty much on time. I'm going to get started with my announcements. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to our class. I'm Maureen Haberfeld. I'm the Lifelong Learning Coordinator at the Senior Center, and I'm going to turn the class over to Tom Friedman, who's our instructor, in a minute. I just have a few announcements. I'm adding another. I'm admitting people as I'm talking and trying to take attendance. Like Tom said, what we found in these classes is that we find it, so we don't get the noise from everybody's house. It's better if everybody except the speaker mutes themselves. You can say hello when you come in if you want, but then mute yourself. And then if you have a question, unmute yourself and ask Tom. That seems to work really well. And then mute yourself when you're finished. That way, you know, we don't get the noise from people's houses, like we said, the squeaky chairs and barking dogs and then lawnmowers outside and things like that. So we appreciate that. I'm going to make a couple of announcements. We have a few upcoming classes in June. For our June classes, the classes that are starting in June, we're going to change the way the registration is going. So instead of emailing me like you're doing for the classes now, you're going to go to our Senior Foundation website, and you can email, you can register for the classes there on Event Espresso. If you have already an account that you've done L3X before, then you can just register with your account, or you can make a new one. And we'll have more instructions on that. There's two classes that I have starting in June. One of them is Florida at the Crossroads of Empire by Josh Goodman, who is from the State Archives. He's excellent. And then we have Dr. Steve Bloomsack, who's going to be teaching a 3-week class on Mars, the planet Mars. The history class by Josh is starting June 4th, and the Mars class is starting June 16th. And again, the registration for those is on the Senior Foundation website. I'm going to make sure I have everybody on the attendance, and then I'm going to turn the class over to Tom, and he's going to be the host. So that means, Tom, you will be in charge of, you know, ending the class. I'll just be a regular participant after that. So again, thanks for coming, and I'm going to change the host to Tom, and then we'll get started with our information. So Tom, let me know, you'll have to admit anybody else that enters the class after that, and you can let me know if anybody else comes late at the end. Okay, thanks.
All right, I'll put it on page 2. So yeah, page 2, so I can see anybody coming in.
Yeah, well, it'll tell you, once you're the host, it'll tell you if somebody's entering.
Oh, okay,
so then you
good.
want to let them in, okay?
That's
All
good.
right, thank you. Okay, you are now becoming the host. Okay.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. Can everybody see the screen that says China Now?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
We're going to start. Now, it's a four-week class. We're basically, the first week is on the philosophy of the Chinese people, philosophies, plural. Second week is the last 2 dynasties, because truly they set the stage for what's happened in this century. Then we will do the nationalists and the communist takeover, and the last one will be pretty much current events. I mean, Mao from current events. So what I want to do now is begin, and there we go.
President Xi Jinping kicked off the party's 19th Congress today with an endurance test for his audience. In a nearly 3.5-hour speech in Beijing, Xi laid out a sweeping vision for the next 5 years.
It's hard to hear you, Tom.
Can you hear the voice in this or not?
No,
But the gathering of
not very
Can
well.
I hear the video?
No, it's very muffled.
All right, this is the National Congress 2 years ago. President Xi is addressing them. And it was a 5-year, it's an explanation of his 5 years in office. As you know, recently as president, he's just had the Constitution changed so that he can remain. These are pictures of him. He is basically one of the 3 leaders, Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong, and now Xi, who have basically assumed very, very, very broad powers and have made cults, in essence, of their personality. He's actually forbid them from showing a lot of these films because people don't want, he doesn't want that quite that way. At the Party Congress, before it started 2 years ago, there was a big exhibition in an exhibition hall adjacent to the convention hall showing all sorts of evidence of his time in office and before. He has moved to consolidate his position. He currently holds virtually every position that you can hold in the PRC. He holds the main ones. The first one is president. The second one is general secretary of the Communist Party, chairman of the military commission. That means you control all the military. And then he's added all these small groups which are specific to things in which he's interested. He's basically got his finger on everything that is occurring today in China. One of the big things he's done is attacked corruption. Corruption was a major problem through Deng Xiaoping's administration and the couple no-names who followed. So he's doing what he can. He's basically penalized over 1 million party members. Some of them have been taken out and shot. But generally, they're just removed from office or shunted aside. It threatens the entire economy. You can read.
Divided while he's pressed forward. So this is sound and fury.
Can you hear that now?
He may have reached
Yes.
communist
Yes.
Good, thank
but
you.
he hasn't managed to bring down China's soaring debt or bump up its economic growth.
We'll get this figured out.
To counteract slowing growth at home, he's projected China's economic prowess overseas through his ambitious One Belt, One Road initiative. It's a $1 trillion infrastructure project. Although some governments are resisting Xi's push, the initiative could potentially link close to 1/3 of all the countries in the world, with China at the center. Xi's also becoming a global leader in fighting climate change. That might seem surprising, since China, with its rapid industrialization, emits more carbon dioxide than any other country. But Xi relies on the support of China's strong middle class. That's about 350 million people. They expect clean air, pure water, and
Okay, I just admitted somebody and that shut the thing down. I'm sorry.
He shouldn't suggest that Xi Jinping is pushing a liberal economy just because he's interested in international trade and investment or a green environment, which is really not pursuing these things all with a very neoliberal.
over the coming days, top party positions will reshuffle once again, meaning Xi has yet another opportunity to cement not just his power for the next 5 years, but ultimately his legacy.
Okay, let's see if we can get to the next slide. There we go. Okay, let me turn this down a little. Is that better sound-wise? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. These are the sources that I've used primarily for the presentations the next 4 weeks. I'll show you the books right after the break. But basically, the Cambridge Illustrated History of China is probably the best single book. It's got all sorts of nice pictures, and the explanations are very lucid in modern English. The next one down, Morton and Lewis, a little more technical, but a very good short history of China. The one below it by Ropp, he's really the editor, is The Heritage of China, a bunch of essays that are extremely valuable. In fact, some of the authors of the books have done essays in that book. Then the two below that, the Spence book and the Gurney book, are probably the two Bibles in this area. Gurney was published way back in '72, keeps being updated again and again. It is extremely long, very detailed, and an excellent research book, as is the Spence book. And finally, the book on the bottom, It's All Chinese to Me, is terrific if you're ever going to be in contact with any number of folks who are Chinese. In fact, in the Bureau, we used to use this book for agents coming into a program where they had to speak Chinese so that they have some idea what to say, what not to say. Okay, let's go on. This is China. I think you're all familiar with, excuse me, wouldn't be on. But basically, the things of interest, can you see my cursor?
Tom,
Yes, ma'am.
someone needs to mute their device. She keeps coughing.
Okay, whoever that is, please be so good as to mute your device.
Tom, I cannot see your screen.
You cannot, who is this?
Dave.
Dave? I don't see you either, Dave. Let's see.
Dave, have you got it on video? Put it on video.
Yeah, because I've got some people here that I can't see, and my guess is they can't see me either.
Yeah, join with
Lynn
the
Evans, are you there?
Pardon?
Lynn Evans, are you there? Donna Houston?
Yes,
Allison?
I'm here.
Okay.
You can't see me. This is
Yeah,
Susan.
this is Lynn Evans.
Can you see me?
I can see the screen.
Good. That's the thing. All right, now can you guys see my cursor?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
You can't see the cursor
Yes.
going? You can't see the cursor?
Yeah.
It's right under
Yes.
Tibet. Okay? All right. Traditionally, China did not include Tibet until the Qing dynasty in the 1800s. It did not necessarily include the Mongolias. Inner Mongolia is now part of China. Mongolia is an independent country. And it did not include Manchuria necessarily. Okay? Let's move on to the next one. Okay. Now, why philosophy? Whoop. I don't know what that is. All right. I'll kind of read this to you, but because I want to explain it as I read it. If you tell a 10 or 12-year-old child to do something and they don't want to do it, what do they say? Why can't I do that? Or that's not fair. Now, the parent's response is cultural. The first one would be, because I told you not to. The second one would be, here's why you can't or shouldn't do whatever the thing is. Now, the first answer would be the appropriate answer in most of Asia, which has a Confucius underlie to the way they think. They're taught to respect elders and institutions from the time that they're old enough to understand their language. Therefore, when you go to, say, a Disney World or something, and you see the American kids fighting with their parents, a lot of times you'll see the Asian kids very orderly, and they do exactly as they're told, because that's been inculcated into their minds since they were toddlers. The second answer would be more the American or British answer, where the kids would say, why can't I do this? Or if that's not fair. The parents would answer, you can't do that because, and give them a reason. Why? Because even though the parents have never read the Magna Carta and probably haven't read the Declaration of Independence, or at least don't remember it particularly, they have been inculcated since they were children into the concepts that even children have a certain worth and therefore an expectation that if they're asked to do something, they're given an explanation. Okay, does that make sense to you all? Nod or something if you agree. All right. What happens when someone violates a social norm badly? You wind up with a child either being spanked or spotted, or if it's adult students in Tiananmen Square, you wind up with the military coming in. Does that make sense? Because they're taught to respect authority, respect the government, respect the officials in government, and they're out there with a Statue of Liberty that they've made, making, basically flaunting everything that the leadership of the country believes in. They're threatened, and therefore they're swatted, spanked. Okay, let's go to the next slide. When you look at Chinese prehistory, essentially, by about 200 BC, philosophically, they are set. In other words, the things they're taught from when they're old enough to first understand Chinese through to when they become adults, the stuff is all set. Now, people say, well, what about Buddhism? That comes later. Well, yeah, it does. But it's not a religion in the sense that Christianity is. It's more philosophical than religious. And so it fits nicely in to that framework that was pretty much finished by 200 BC. We'll talk about that a little bit. The Zhou dynasty is where this all happened. What was happening? The Western Zhou was a solid democracy, 300 or 400 years. And then it began to fall apart, and that's the Eastern Zhou. They literally moved their capital across the river to be safer from those nasty people coming in from Mongolia and such. Okay. As things are really beginning to get bad, 400 or 500 BC, all of a sudden, you wind up with a flowering of philosophy. Now, what is that similar to us? Think about the United States before we were a country and when we wanted to pull away from the kings of England. What happened? Philosophically, there was a flowering. Your Jeffersons, your Hamiltons, all these people came up in a time of strife because that's when philosophy generally occurs. If you look at great French philosophy, it's all immediately before and after the French Revolution. Okay? The Eastern Zhou. In China, there is no creation myth, period. They don't care. It's as simple as that. They're here. So what are they interested in? Nature around them, things around them, moral law. You don't do things because God says, you do things because they're right. It's a moral law. Religion is basically a practical thing, not a mythical concern, even when they get Buddhism later. Likewise, as I say, ethics and how you conduct life really matter. And then these philosophers come up and they verbalize what people were thinking all those years. That's really what anybody who writes something does, is that they basically take what's out there and assemble it in some sort of coherent fashion. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The 4 or 5 major coherent philosophies which the Chinese take bits and pieces from and use the rest of their history, including Mao and the rest of them. They all use these things. You can't escape them. What's basic? The veneration of ancestors is a major thing. Now, how does that work? It's not just ancestors you venerate. You also respect your living parents and grandparents. You respect the village leader. You respect the emperor or the chairman of the Communist Party. Heaven is essentially nature-based, and we'll talk about that a little bit in Taoism. No creator, focused on how things work. They don't have opposites like life and death, mind and body, natural and supernatural. What they have is rather complementary things. Night follows day. Think about dusk. Think about dawn. Knowledge and action. The one spurs the other, hopefully. And we'll see that when we talk about Sun Tzu, the art of war. Okay. Again, what we're going to be talking about is the yellow stuff here, which is Confucius, Mao Tzu, Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu, and Sheng Yang, Lord Shang. Okay. Confucianism. Now, Confucianism, it's a generic Western term. There is no such thing per se. It's just too broad. It's a worldview, it's a social ethic, political philosophy, scholarly tradition, and a way of life. Though it's grouped many times with Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and all those things, it's not an organized religion. There's nothing religious about it. It's a very practical way of looking at the world, assuming you agree with the basic assumptions, which some folks do and some don't. He saw himself as a transmitter rather than a creator. Transmitter, he assembled things, thought about them, and pushed them out in a coherent scheme. Had a profound faith in the cumulative culture of the past. This guy is a traditionalist. He doesn't want to see wholesale changes. We work on things gradually. They go for rediscovery, revitalization, and adaptation. Not change, but adaptation. You adapt from the living traditions of the Zhou dynasty. Z-H-O-U, Zhou. Okay. He was a teacher in humanity, and he stated things in terms of human care, which was he sought to bring comfort to the old, to have trust in friends, and to cherish the young. There was a moral community that began with a holistic reflection on the human condition. In other words, it's essentially a very practical thing. You tend to look at situations and try to come up with solutions. He didn't dwell on the abstract, such as nature. We'll get to that in the Taoists. He sought to understand the actual situation of a given time and use that as a point of departure. It's very pragmatic, isn't it? In other words, the situation determines what the solution will be, if there is one. His aims were to restore trust in government. That's important because it's not just government, it's family. It's everything that makes China, China. And to transform the society into a moral community by cultivating a sense of human caring in both politics and society. Now, if you take a look at the right side of that picture, those are sand sculptures that were done in 2012. And I think it's so interesting that today the Communist Party is promoting Confucianism, which the communists as early as 1920 talked about him as being absolutely, reactionary. When your father is alive, to observe his intentions. After he passes away, model yourself on his memory. And if in 3 years you have not deviated from your father's ways, then you may be considered a filial child. Interesting, huh? If we can get every generation to act just like the ones before, you can see why the early communists weren't too particularly thrilled with that, because they were making a very, very pronounced break from the past. And then the one I like the most. By 15, I was intent on learning. By 30, I was standing straight. By 40, I was no longer confused. By 50, I knew heaven's commands. By 60, I was attuned. And at our age, at 70, I would follow my heart's desires without transgressing what is right. Interesting, huh? Gentleman understands moral duty. The petty person knows about profit. There's something there for everyone, isn't there, when you think about it? But anyway. Okay, beyond Confucius, two major disciples Munzi, or Mencius, he said that everybody's endowed with four feelings: commiseration, shame, modesty, and a sense of right and wrong. And they are the basis for cultivating the four cardinal values of humanity, righteousness, ritual, customs. Okay, if you see ritual, think regular customs that people have, and wisdom. Now, this isn't a rapidly changing view of the world, is it? It's a very, we'll keep things about as they are and make little tinkers around the edges. We're moral not because we're told we must be good, but because our deepest nature spontaneously expresses itself as goodness. Now, that's his view. Let's see just what we come up with on this one.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Walker. I teach philosophy and humanities at Yale and U.S. College.
If you can hear it, give me a thumb up.
Today, I'm going to take a look at Mengzi's views on human nature. In particular, I'm going to take a look at Mengzi's defense of the claim that human nature is good. Mengzi, also known as Mencius, was an early Confucian philosopher. He lived in the 300s BCE. Like Confucius, Mengzi was concerned to defend a certain conception of the good life for human beings. Call this conception of the good life the Confucian way, or the Confucian Tao. According to the Confucian way, possessing virtues like benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom are central to a life well lived. When Mengzi says that human nature is good, Mengzi's thought is that human beings have innate potentials or predispositions toward such virtues. We naturally tend toward these virtues. As Mengzi says, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom are not welded to us externally. We inherently have them. In presenting this view, Mengzi uses an agricultural metaphor. He describes these potentials and predispositions as sprouts of virtue. Mengzi, in turn, locates these sprouts of virtue in the heart, or heart-mind, which Mengzi identifies as the seat of our cognitive and affective dispositions. Mengzi's thought is that if we fully cultivate our sprouts, if we tend to our predispositions toward virtue and become fully virtuous, then we will bring our human nature to full fruition. We will flourish as human beings. But what evidence does Mengzi adduce for the view that human nature is good? On what basis, in other words, does Mengzi think that we have such predispositions toward benevolence, righteousness, and the like? Here, I want to take a look at one of the most famous arguments in the Mengzi. It appears in Mengzi 2a6. Like some other famous arguments in the history of philosophy, it involves a thought experiment. I'll call Mengzi's thought experiment the child and the well case. Ladies and gentlemen, meet little Ria. Suppose that little Ria is toddling right along through this field. And suppose further that she's heading oblivious.
Give me just 1 second. There we go.
Right toward this scary looking well. There's the well, there's little Ria toddling along, getting closer. Ah! I guess I should add that what you saw was only a dramatization. According to Mengzi, anyone who saw little Ria about to toddle into that well would have an immediate, non-reflective gut reaction. As Mengzi says in 2a6, anyone would feel a surge of alarm and compassion. Indeed, simply imagining the child in the well case vividly to yourselves feels something of this.
This is more philosophy.
So what should we conclude from Mengzi's child and the well thought?
Sorry.
According to Mengzi, our non-reflective gut...
I'm muting the folks who are not muted because we're getting extraneous sounds. Okay.
That reaction to little Ria's looming danger shows that we have innate predispositions toward benevolence. On Mengzi's view, our response to little Ria's potential disaster is hardwired. Human beings, by nature, are simply predisposed to respond with alarm and compassion when they see defenseless innocents about to face harm. And our alarm and compassion, Mengzi insists, reveals the sprout of benevolence in human nature. To be sure, it doesn't show that we possess the fully developed virtue of benevolence, but Mengzi thinks that it reveals the germ or bud of benevolence, a kind of proto-version of benevolence that can be cultivated to maturity. Mengzi recognizes, however, that one might offer different accounts of our reactions. According to one alternative proposal, proposal, perhaps one's response to little Leah's danger is instrumentally motivated. In other words, maybe one feels alarm and compassion for little Leah because one has certain ends in view, or because one has ulterior motives. Mengzi, however, rejects this instrumental account. Hearing about little Leah, Mengzi says, one would feel alarm and compassion not because one sought to get in good with the child's parents, not because one wanted fame among their neighbors and friends, and not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries. What's important, Mengzi thinks, is that our alarmed and compassionate response is spontaneous and unthinking. That shows that our response emerges without calculation. Still, Mengzi's view of human nature faces another challenge. It seems demonstrably false that human nature is good. If human nature is good, then vice should be rare. We shouldn't often see brutishness, plunder, banality, selfishness, petty tyranny, and other nasty traits. But vice isn't rare. Hence, it might seem Mengzi's view is wrong. Contrary to Mengzi, it might seem human nature is bad. And faced with this kind of challenge, Mengzi's strategy is to get human nature off the hook. If human beings are bad, Mengzi argues, it's not because their nature is bad. Mengzi puts the point this way. As for their essence, human beings can become good. This is what I mean by calling their natures good. As for their becoming not good, this is not the fault of their potential. Or, as Mengzi puts the point elsewhere, it is not the case that only the worthy person has this heart, that is, the heart or sprout of courage. All human beings have it. The worthy person simply never loses it. In other words, Mengzi is fully aware that the world is full of bad human beings. But Mengzi suggests, don't blame human nature for such badness. Instead, blame the stunting of human nature for such badness. Human nature does have predispositions toward virtue, but these predispositions can be corrupted. To spell out this response, Mengzi offers a parable, the parable of Ox Mountain, which appears in Mengzi 6a8. Here's Ox Mountain. By nature, it's verdant and woody, and its soil is rich. But if hatchets and axes and grazing oxen and sheep have their day at the vegetation on Ox Mountain, you shouldn't be surprised if the mountain becomes barren. Here, Mengzi holds, there's no reason to think that Ox Mountain is naturally barren. Likewise, Mengzi insists, human beings by nature have predispositions toward benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom. But if one grows up in a chaotic environment, neglected by narcissistic parents, surrounded by too much money, and free to run wild with impunity, then don't be surprised if one's own good nature similarly loses its capacity to blossom. Yet as with Ox Mountain, Mengzi believes, there's no reason to think that human beings are naturally bad. For Mengzi, cultivating virtue does not constitute a mutilation or radical transformation of one's human nature. Cultivating benevolence and righteousness is not like making a willow tree into cups and bowls. In other words, ethical education is not a kind of maiming. On the contrary, Mengzi thinks that ethical education is like good gardening. It constitutes a tending that enables innate tendencies to reach fruition. So to return to the point about the willow tree, ethical education is more like caring for and nurturing the willow tree so that it reaches its full growth.
Okay. Gosh. How is my volume now? Is it better? Just me?
Just you. The
Can
other
you hear me or not?
video is not.
Oh, the video, yeah, the video is over. For whatever reason.
You're good, Tom.
Okay. Whoop. Oh, okay. Just a minute here. We got a little problem. It doesn't want to go to the next slide. All right, let's do it. Here we go. Okay. Then you run into the next major school of Confucianism, if you want to call it that, and that's Sun Tzu. Now, he believed the opposite. He believed that human nature is evil. and believed that Mencius was naive. He said we need self-cultivation. How? He stressed cult socialization based upon objective standards in laws, order, authority, and rituals. So basically, what you've got, is it maybe nature versus nurture? I'm not so certain. It's not a real Western type thing. And so it isn't that. But what he's basically saying is people are basically bad and they need to be held to very objective standards to keep them good. In other words, the laws have to be very specific. The authority figures must be there. The rituals, the customs must be long-standing and practiced by everyone so that you stay, as a good person. Now, this is a little shorter, but I think this is kind of interesting too.
Hello, I'm David Wong, a professor of philosophy at Duke University, and I'm going to talk about Xunzi, an early Chinese philosopher who lived during the 4th and 3rd century BCE. He was a follower of Confucius and was best known for his view that human nature is bad.
Any way to turn that up?
Another Confucian named Mengzi, or as he came to be known in the West, Mencius, for holding that human nature is good.
Can you hear that?
Recommend if you have
Better. Thank you.
Try the closed captioning on the bottom of the screen. The CC down there at the very bottom. See if that works.
That human beings have
yes.
Good, thank you.
Into full-blown goodness. We sometimes liken these dispositions to sprouts. Sprouts have a natural direction of growth if nurtured by water, sun, fertile soil, and human effort. If we are raised in a secure environment where we do not have to constantly worry about our survival, if we are given ethical education, and if we make the personal effort to develop what is good in ourselves, we can grow our sprout-like compassion into healthy plants of goodness. Xunzi places himself in diametrical opposition to Mengzi. He believed that human beings are born with a fondness for profit, with hatred and dislike of others, and desires for sensual pleasure. If we follow our natures, Xunzi argued, we will engage in continued destructive conflict with each other. That is what he meant by saying human nature is bad. Fortunately, we human beings also have the capacity to think and to approve or disapprove of where our natural feelings and desires lead us. Xunzi believed that through our intelligence, human beings could turn our naturally ugly tendencies towards chaos and conflict into lives of harmony and beauty. In the ancient past, Xunzi believed, the most far-seeing of human beings, the sages, realized that acting naturally is the surest path to self-destruction. The sages created ideas of right and wrong that curbed the unrestrained pursuit of satisfying our own desires and to require consideration of others. The sages created customs called rituals that train us to respect others and to be grateful for what they give us. One ritual Xunzi discussed was the village drinking ceremony. Everyone gathers for a toast, but only one cup is used, from which everyone drinks in order of seniority. The order of drinking teaches the younger to defer to the older, and drinking from one cup teaches them that they are one village and that they depend on each other. Xunzi also placed special importance on the rituals of mourning and burial of deceased parents. Because parents have given us the gift of our lives and have nurtured us, we must express our deepest gratitudes and feelings of loss. Xunzi used a metaphor for the human path to goodness that is very different from Mengzi's sprouts growing into healthy plants. He thought of human beings as craftsmen who fashioned themselves into something beautiful that we would never become naturally. We are like potters who take the lumpy clay of our natures and turn them into beautiful vessels. The sages gave us the instruments for crafting ourselves, ideas of right and wrong and rituals. But this belief in the transforming power of ritual poses a problem for Xunzi. How can we become so good when we begin as bad creatures with the desire for profit, hate, and dislike of others, and desires for sensual pleasure? Xunzi's answer is that there are some natural impulses that are strengthened when we express them through ritual. He says that all creatures of blood and breath, not just humans, love members of their own kind. They will grieve over the loss of their mates. His example was of the behavior of birds, but today you might think of the behavior of elephants, who seem to grieve for dead members of their family and who have been known to stay beside the bodies of their deceased friends for 3 days without moving from the spot. Thus, in the end, Xunzi might have recognized that along with all the bad motivations that get us into trouble, we have impulses that tie us to each other and that can be strengthened by rituals, such as the village drinking ceremony and rituals of mourning and burial of those to whom we are grateful. We human animals are complicated and conflicted in our motivations. And Xunzi might be right in holding that we must craft ourselves to restrain the motivations that get us into trouble and to strengthen the motivations that allow us to harmonize with each other.
Okay, let's see. There we go. Okay, so Chinese Communist Party and Confucius have had a rather tortured history. Can you hear me now, or am I too loud? Is that better?
Very good. Just stay the way you are.
All righty.
Good.
It's tough. Mao Zedong tried to wipe out the image of Confucius during the Cultural Revolution. The picture here, that's Confucius there that they're proceeding to get ready to chop up. It's a wooden Confucius. Now, he's being presented as uniquely Chinese sage, if not a patriotic figure, which I think would cause him to shake his head a little bit. As China pushes harder to enter the international stage and become a major player, Confucius is needed. And I think part of it is that, and that's the next slide, but I'll say it ahead of time, is they get more and more wealth. In fact, we can go on, is they get more and more wealth. They're beginning to see that there's less and less moral backbone to the folks who are making the wealth. The corruption campaign fits very nicely into this Chinese adoption today of Confucius, because the ruler is a moral ruler. His underlings have to do their jobs in a moral way, something Confucius believed in very strongly. That is something that they are badly in need of. Good instance of that. Remember, I guess about 10 years ago, people wound up with gypsum board in their homes that was possessed, I forget the chemical that was in it, but it was asbestos, I believe. The Chinese had no problem exporting that. A moral businessman would not use contaminated gypsum. You know, they use only good gypsum. That's the type of thing that they realize they need right now. Now, I'm going to go by the next slide, if I can get to it. Oh, come on. Here we go. I'm not going to do that one. That's just a thing where they're promoting temples to Confucius all over China, and we're running a little late. I want to go through Mao Tse here rather quickly. Mao Tse lived about 60 years after Confucius. He wanted to establish an egalitarian society based on a sense of mutual aid and devotion to common good. Now, that's a universal law versus the Confucian respect for existing ruling hierarchy. His views strongly suggest to me communism, socialism, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. That's a Mao Tse type statement. It's by Karl Marx. this philosophy, it includes, they don't want people to have a lust for profit or luxury, accumulation of wealth. They don't want war and fighting. Now, incidentally, it's very interesting. If you adopt some of this stuff, you don't have to adopt it all. It's philosophy. So the military power war thing, you can kind of ignore while you accept the rest of it. It's very interesting. A universal frugality, uniform regulation of expenditure, strict respect for laws, fair gods and spirits. Okay. Now, where are we going? Oh, I'm going backwards. All right. Woo, what have we done here? We don't want that. All right. He was famous for his debating. That's real nice. The things on this slide that really matter is he argued that if neighbors and folks helped each other all the time and loved each other, there wouldn't be any war. Okay? And I mean, that's relatively simple. Universal love, and it's subversive in a sense to what the Confucius believed, because if everybody is a friend and kind of equal and all doing their thing together, what happens to the authority structure that's supposedly telling them what to do? They're basically all going to look at the authority figures and say, we're doing this thing for each other. So that's the reason Confucius had a big problem with Mao Zedong. Gurnett believes the ideas had little influence on Chinese thought. And I don't agree entirely. I agree to a degree and I don't agree to a degree. It disappeared for about 2,000 years, but it resurfaced. He was kind of rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, who's in power in the 20th century? The nationalists and then the communists. This thing is almost a cultural justification for a lot of the socialist ideas. At any rate, I leave that to you, but I do believe that when this resurfaced, it influenced a lot of them. Okay, it is break time. That's the reason I hustled a little bit. We'll take about a 5-minute break and come back and then romp through to the end. Thank you. Are there any questions while we're breaking? No? Okay. Hi, everybody. All right. So I say we'll come back.
Is there any way that you could summarize the videos that you were showing? Because I'm not able to read the closed captions because of my eyesight.
Sure.
And the volume level was okay, but it the audio came across as kind of muffled.
Yeah. Sure. Hang on. Let me go back if I can. Hold on. I got to get there. I'm beginning to understand how this works. All right. If you go back to the Confucius stuff, all right. Mensa essentially believes everybody's born good. And we enculturate, if they are enculturated properly, they remain good. In fact, they get better. Okay? They learn through the rituals of society, all those things they need to know to be good people, and they remain that way, hopefully. Now, if you go to Sun Tzu, he believes everybody is born is a little selfish twit, so to speak. How do we make them better? Those same cultural institutions, your ritual, you school them and teach them to be better people. Okay? So they both, one starts out where you're good, one starts out where you're bad. What really matters is the socialization. We make them all good. In the one they stay good or maybe become better. In the other one they go from bad to good. How do you become bad? If somehow you're enculturated. If you've got parents who are awful, or you grow up in being a bad person. But if you're raised the proper way, with the rituals, with all those understanding of where you stand and where your place in society, you'll be fine. Does that explain those? And I think the significant thing, Lynn,
Yes,
is
that was good.
They're
Yeah,
both,
thank you
they're
very
both-
much.
They're both Confucius. Therefore, the big stress is on the customs, the rituals, those things that make you the way you're supposed to be. Whether you start bad, whether you start good, in the end, if you've been enculturated properly, you'll be good. Not like on raising a child. If you let the child just do anything, they'll wind up being a selfish person. On the other hand, if you show them that there are bounds, then they hopefully will turn out all right. Okay.
But that's assuming that the child has badness in them then.
Say again?
But that's assuming then that the child has badness in them. I mean, yeah, if you think that they're all bad, then okay. But if you think they're good, then how can they have badness in them? It's interesting to see how they separated it out. Thank you. It's very interesting.
Penny, that's a philosophical type discussion. And I remember at this point, they were centuries earlier than we Christians discussed how many angels could sit on the head of a pin. And that was a great philosophical discussion of the age in about 900 to 1100 AD. So what can I tell you? Yes. All I can do is relate to you what went together to cause the way the thought pattern goes. And the thought pattern is heavy with ritual because ritual makes everything work. It's heavy avoiding change because if we honor those above us, we don't want to remove them, right?
Mm.
So that type of thought matters in a whole lot because it gets used different ways. And I think the interesting thing that the present communist government is using it for is, first of all, it cuts down on dissent. Because if you truly believe in Confucius, you're not a dissenter. It also pushes personal values, morals, which have been lacking. And they know they've been lacking. So those types of things are definitely Confucian. And it's an interesting thing because the parts of Confucius that we would consider to be valuable would be the moral part. The part that we would look at that wouldn't be so bad is to say, hey, you want to be so ritualized, so hemmed in by your social structure, so to speak, that you can't get better or can't change things that are wrong. And one of the things that is wrong there right now is the fact that they don't have any freedom of speech. They don't have any ability to pick their own government. But hey, under Confucius, you honor whoever the governor or the emperor is, and you don't seek to change him. So they're using Confucius for their own purposes, which is what philosophy is for, in a sense. People use it to justify what they want to do. They pick and choose. You cherry pick the things out of philosophy that are useful to you and ignore the stuff that's not. For instance, Mozart, one of the big things is avoiding wars. Well, I mean, you know, on the one hand, you want everybody equal in the village and everybody doing nice things for everybody else and all those good things. So you stress that and then you ignore the war part. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's how philosophies go, so to speak. All righty, we ready to move forward? Okay.
One more question.
Yes.
You mentioned
before you do it, Susan, everybody, please identify yourself by name because I've got 2 pages of you all, and I've got to find the right person because I like to look at you when you talk to me. Okay. Even though my head is going the other way, it's going toward the screen. But yeah, go ahead.
All right, Susan Robinson.
Yes,
you had some quotes at the beginning from the Analects.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say any more about that? Is that still published, and are they still using some of those, or?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Without a doubt. I mean, the Analects are the basis of most of the Confucian philosophy.
Okay.
So yes, that's significant stuff.
Okay,
Shall we
thanks.
go? All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is Tao, Tao, depending on whether you're using Wade Giles or you're using the communist version of Pinyin. Tao means the way. And I mean, there's a Confucius Tao, but this is simply the Tao, the way. Lao Tzu may or may not have lived. He may or may not have written anything. We don't know. But in point of fact, they've got the collected works of, so to speak. This is one I like. I'm going to read it because I think it's interesting. I will cast out wisdom and reject learning. Think cultural revolution. My thoughts shall wander in the silent void, always repenting of wrongs done, will never bring my heart to rest. I cast my hook in a single stream, but my joy is as though I possessed a kingdom. I loose my hair and go singing. To the four frontiers men join in my refrain. This is the purport of my song. My thoughts shall wander in the silver void. It almost sounds like something out of the 60s. Doesn't it? It's a very freewheeling worldview. Nature is a big deal. It's poetical. It's elliptical. It's seeking accord with nature, the way. It's a mystical preference for yielding over the assertive and the silence over words. And this kind of explains it in a sense. Water benefits all creatures, but does not compete. And I would add, Taoists don't like to compete. It occupies the places people disdain and thus comes near to the way. It helps everyone and it's not in competition. That's the way you should seek to be. When everyone in the world sees beauty, ugliness is already there. When everyone sees good in the good, bad is already there. Kind of strange, huh? All right. Where Confucius and his disciples were activists who sought to make the governing better, Taoists were preoccupied with man's place in the natural world. What does a Taoist do if they really are concerned about things? They go build a shack in the middle of the woods like Henry Thoreau and live alone for a while and get close to nature. They defended private life and wanted rulers to leave people alone. They were concerned that human actions upset the natural order of things. And the way was indivisible, indescribable, immaterial, force, or energy. That is the source of all that exists or happiness. Let's go over those again real quick. Defended private life and wanted rulers to leave people alone. That's something that's really useful if you've got a bad ruler, because your natural predisposition is to be against the ruler. Doesn't that make sense? You're concerned that human actions upset the natural order of things. These people who are Taoists tend to be tree huggers, so to speak. I mean, they want to keep nature real nice. And the way is basically, it's amorphous. It's all sorts of different things to all sorts of different people. Does that make sense? Okay. The yin and yang is one of the basic Taoist principles. It's not just in China, it's in Korea, which is where you ordinarily see this. Koreans use it a great deal. It's a mutuality of opposites, a dualism, matter versus space, a being versus non-being. Now, does that mean they're opposites per se? To a degree, yes, but not in the way we tend to think about it. For instance, males and females are both people first, and then they're males and females. When they go to seek harmony with nature, does it matter particularly to males and females? Not really. Light versus dark, one leads to the other and back, low, high. So at any rate, you've got this duality that plays through everything. And One implication of these ideas is that almost any purposeful action is counterproductive. In other words, I'd rather run away to my little shack than raise heck with the ruler if I don't like what's going on. The ruler should allow a return to a natural state in which people are ignorant and content. That's an interesting one. Think Cultural Revolution. The educated folks and the business folks are all sent out to the field to be re-educated by the peasants. Now, I'm not saying they cite Lao Tzu when they do that, but never forget it's in the back of their minds, because this stuff has been pushed into their heads since they were babies. And therefore, sometimes you're not aware of where you get an idea. It just is kind of organic to you. That is that. And here, do not honor the worthy, and the people will not compete. Do not value treasures, and the people will not steal. Do not display what others want, and the people will not have their hearts confused. A sage governs this way. He empties people's minds and fills their bellies. He weakens their wills and strengthens their bones. Keep the people always without knowledge and without desires, for the clever will not dare act. Engage in no action, and order will prevail. Very strange. Excuse me. Precisely the opposite of what the Confucius would say. They say, create order, because that order, that culture, that way things are organized is what makes people good. Here they're saying, do precisely the opposite. You don't find many Taoists who are strong believers in what Confucius said, and vice versa. Out of this, I want to go down to this part here. This is about, they asked him, Zhongzi, about his wife's death. And he says, when she first died, how could I escape the feeling of loss? And then I looked back to the beginning, before she had life, before she had form. This is that live, dead thing that's not opposites necessarily, it's a continuum. Form appeared, with changes in form, life began. Now there's another change bringing death. This is like the progression of the four seasons. Here she was lying down to sleep in a huge room, and I followed her, sobbing and wailing. And then I realized my actions showed I hadn't understood destiny. I stopped. And this is a basis for a basic Chinese view of the world going on and on and on and on. It fits in with ancestor worship, or ancestor veneration, more properly put. Fits in with all sorts of things. It fits in with the idea that I'm Chinese and everything that's ever happened before is part of me. It's a very, very interesting way of looking at the world, and very different than what most of us. I mean, for instance, most of us here, I assume, are Christian or Jewish. If you are, do you feel that you're part of what happened in 10 AD? Not particularly. The view here is in that flow. Now, flow of history is important because flow of history is also one of the basis of Marx's ideas. Communism, this stream that flows on forever and things flow off, but everything flows through. It fits nicely, and it makes it somewhat easier for someone from the society to accept that kind of view, which is what we're talking about, basically. Cherry picking, those things which are helpful. A lot of times it's not a conscious cherry pick either, because if you're faced with something that's changing and you have to adapt to it, this gives you an ability to adapt to it. Does that make sense? I hope it does. So Taoists are concerned with watching nature, finding the ebb and flow of the universe. Ebb and flow, kind of like the communist river that goes on. This has led to many Taoists becoming preeminent in science and in the arts, as they accept change as the only constant in life. Because, trees grow and they fall, but they're still part of the forest. And so they will learn to adapt to modern world. Okay. Taoism today. Let's see how we're running, 2:36. All right, we can do, well, no, we're not going to do that one. I'm sorry. It's a movie we don't have much enough. Well, we can do 4 minutes.
Shanghai's City God Temple, a key place for Taoist followers.
Can you hear?
Xi Jinping is the head of the city's Taoist Association. This ritual is for conveying
Mute everybody.
to Master Xi, Tao is God, a rule in nature, and a way of life. It's China's only indigenous religion, but also its weakest. Xi Jinping wants to make a change.
I think Taoism in today's society is having a big chance for development. Taoism is part of Chinese traditional culture, which contains the cultural genes. Since the beginning of this century, there's been a growing national mentality to return to traditional culture, and the confidence in such a trend is growing. Against this background, it's important to excavate the hidden treasures of Taoism and provide some spiritual guidance to ordinary people.
Master Xi believes one of the reasons that Taoism is not developing fast comes from not effectively responding to people's anxieties. He believes the future of Taoism relies on how it can be explained to different people and cultures.
The Chinese culture emphasizes coexistence, which can be found in Taoism. For example, we say one heart embraces all, and all rivers run into the sea. These ideas have become our national character. Our attitude towards foreign culture is not to seek confrontation, but to advocate mutual integration, although it may start out with some friction.
Religious practice in China has enjoyed a more relaxed atmosphere, enabling the resurgence of different beliefs. The official number is around 100 million believers, but many say the real number is far greater.
Taoism is an ancient tradition grounded in the principle of harmony. It has been a guiding force of Chinese philosophy for centuries. Many believe it can keep its appeal in today's fast-changing society and help make the world a better place.
Shanghai has China's most renowned Taoist academy. It enrolls students every 4 years. They are on a strict timetable for cultivation. 24-year-old Liu Chao is finishing up his studies. He says it's from a...
Sorry, we're gonna stop this one and go on. Am I too loud?
Nope.
Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Now, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. He believed that leadership was a matter of intelligence, trustworthiness, humaneness, courage, and sternness. This is a guy fighting now. So only a brilliant ruler or wise general would be able to use the highly intelligent person for espionage. Hello? Can you hear me now? Because we're getting some voices in the background. Can you hear me all? Someone raise a hand if you can hear me.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm gonna, time-wise, I think I'm gonna play part of this because it's kind of interesting.
In the age of bloody civil war, 2,500 years ago, a Chinese military commander, strategist, and philosopher emerged. His name, Sun Tzu. After successfully defending the state of Wu against its neighbor Chu to the west, a book formerly known as Master Sun's Military Methods was born, which has later become known as The Art of War. The Art of War is the most influential treatise on war ever written, consisting of 13 chapters, each of which is devoted to one aspect of warfare. It has shaped the way in which conflicts have been fought thousands of years. From the Japanese samurai to the Napoleonic War. Not only has the book influenced military commanders and generals all over the world, it has had resounding effects on politics, sports, and business to this day. The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It's a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. Hence, it's a subject of inquiry which can on no account be neglected. Sun Tzu has a holistic philosophy that if you follow correctly and study thoroughly, you will be victorious. Sun Tzu says, avoid what is strong and strike at what is weak. Sun Tzu is a strong believer that winning the war with as little unnecessary combat as possible is the key to true victory. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting, and the key to doing so is to know your enemy well. If your opponent is arrogant, pretend to be weak, so he will underestimate you. If he is relaxing, attack and give him no rest.
That's
if
Normandy.
his forces are united, separate them. Sun Tzu is essentially saying that if you know your opponent's weaknesses and how to exploit them, you will never lose.
They attacked the weary Persians as they disembarked their ship and sheathed the legs after a month at sea. They attacked before they could establish their war camp and supply their soldiers.
Sun Tzu says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. During the mid-1960s, a war took place between the North Vietnamese communists and the United States of America. Instead of confronting the Americans head-on, the Viet Cong had a different idea in mind. They used unconventional guerrilla warfare tactics, which included hit-and-run strategies. This proved very effective against the much larger military of the Americans. It's more important to outthink your enemy than to outfight him. The Viet Cong forces were inferior to the Americans in both man and firepower, so guerrilla warfare tactics allowed them to inflict significant damage while keeping their casualties to a minimum. They also had unparalleled knowledge of the terrain. This included a vast network of underground tunnels, allowing them to evade carpet bombing and escape the enemy. The terrain was also laced with various booby traps and landmines. Even though the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were heavily out-armed by the American superpower, they were still able to defeat them as they truly understood Sun Tzu's philosophy. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. This philosophy can be seen in the World War II invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day. The British created several fictional units of troops stationed in Scotland who were ready to invade Europe for its northern regions, in particular Scandinavia. They then used several misinformation techniques to persuade Hitler that 350,000 of these troops were planned to attack. Radio chatter in Scotland lit up with talks of these troops preparing for an overseas assault, and many of these transmissions were made easily interceptable. Allied spies who had been able to infiltrate the Germans reported these developments as well, reinforcing their legitimacy. These spies also took photographs of planes and tanks posed for invasion, but these were actually blow-up models in most cases. All this caused dozens of German divisions to go up to bogus locations and wait for an imaginary army to show up, whilst important battles were fought elsewhere. This method of dividing enemy forces was also employed to a greater extent on D-Day itself. Soviet forces kept around 1 million of the German forces busy on the Eastern Front, whilst the Allied invasion occurred on the Western Front. This tactic of dividing the enemy is one of Sun Tzu's key philosophies and allowed the Allies to achieve victory and eventually win the war. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video,
For the next page. There we go. The thing I want to say about Sun Tzu before we go on, but I can't really go back to the last slide because it's a movie, is this. Americans seem to think that somehow they can understand what the Chinese are doing without understanding how they think. You need to understand that they will be working very hard to understand how we think as they plot their actions. So if you're not aware of how they think, how are you ever going to be able to have a clue what they may do next? And that's what we used to use this for in the government. We would learn as much as we could about whatever the opposite, the enemy per se, was in whatever circumstance we're looking at, so that we could have at least some idea. First of all, it helps in interpreting things that have already occurred. I mean, anyone is always good at interpreting, not anyone, but anybody who understands these things. We're pretty good at interpreting what has occurred and why it occurred. However, when you get into the realm of trying to forecast what's going to happen in the future, that is guesswork at best. But if you don't have the fundamental knowledge underneath everything as you look, you're wasting your time trying to figure out what's going to happen. Okay, next one we're going to look at is legalism. Now, this is a real short one, I believe. And I think we'll skip it because we don't have a lot of time. 2 minutes. Let's do this real quick. Okay. Let's see. For some reason, we're getting no sound on this one.
With their own interests, the legalists believed that society functioned best through strong government control and absolute obedience to authority, so they created laws that ordered strict punishments and rewards for behavior. Confucius believed in virtue and natural order, but the legalists believed that all human activity should be directed toward increasing the power of the ruler and the government. The legalists held power by suppressing anyone who disagreed with them. China.
What does that remind you of? Literally any dictatorship, correct? That is how they hold power. They use their military and they suppress anything, secret police, all those types of things. Go on.
Had not been a unified nation for hundreds of years when the legalists came to power. During an era that was later called the Age of Warring States, local rulers controlled many small kingdoms. The ruler of the Qin state embraced the legalist philosophy. The Qin united China by about 214 BCE by conquering most rival kingdoms. The first Qin ruler of a united China took the title Shui Huangti, which means August Lord or First Emperor. To stop any criticism, Shui Huangti and the legalists banned all books on history and of classic Chinese literature that glorified past rulers. The first emperor ordered all non-essential books collected and burned. He only allowed books on agriculture, medicine, and pharmacy. Books written about Confucius and his philosophy were destroyed. During this period, hundreds of scholars were put to death, many of them being buried alive. The legalists lost power shortly after the death of the first emperor, and the succeeding rulers ended laws that destroyed books. Confucius's teaching managed to survive the burning of the books because his philosophy was often handed down orally from master to student. Thus, it was possible to reconstruct the text both from memory and from surviving manuscripts.
Okay, that's an introduction to legalism. Legalism is the last major philosophical basis of Chinese thought that we're going to talk about today. There's no interest here in cosmology, origin, evolution, eventual fate of the universe, like the Taoists. There's no interest in the nature of knowledge or justification or rationality of belief like Confucius or personal ethics. It's essentially, it's a structure to protect the status quo, to make the ruler essentially untouchable. What did they do? The first thing they did was they abolished the aristocracy that had existed before. Who's that sound like? That's what the communists did when they came in, isn't it? They got rid of everybody. Nationalists did it before them. Farmers were subject to laws and governance of the state, but they owned their own farms. When Mao Zedong first redistributed land in 49, every farmer got a plot. That was before they went into co-ops and then communes, where they took it back from them. But at first, that's what they did. State alone determines rank and privileges. Well, you get rid of everybody who's been part of the power structure, put your own people in, you can control all rank and privileges. Farmers were free to buy and sell land, but again, under Mao, they were at first, but after a bit, it was all taken back. Families were organized into mutual responsibility groups. Doesn't that sound familiar? Mao Tse. Each member responsible for the crimes of the other. This is what they added to it. Greece, some of the islands, Second World War. You shoot a Nazi, they pull 10 Greeks and shoot them. Why? Because they're responsible too, sure. But that's the type of view here. One member of the family is no good, the whole family's in trouble. For instance, Xi, the present president, chairman of the Communist Party, the whole bit, right? He was sent along with his father, who was in trouble, out to the farms for years and years during the Cultural Revolution. They thought nothing of sending the wife and kids along with the person who supposedly was in trouble. Finally, vagrants and criminals are forced into penal labor. Same type of thing, again, as the Cultural Revolution. It's a ruthless brand of statecraft. And the Qin used it to essentially unify China. Wise people create laws while ignorant ones are controlled by them. The worthy alter the rights while the unworthy are held fast by them. Nice concept, huh? Rulers do not generally display virtue, wisdom, or courage. It's not really necessary. They have the laws. The laws provide a means of transcending the personal limitations of rulers. So there's no moral ruler like Confucianism here. It is just flat out, it's the ruler, and we're going to do everything we can to keep him in. Rulers should be worried about changing the laws of their predecessors. Well, it's not too relevant to our discussion. Good government survives the death of a bad ruler, sure. Sages cannot transfer to others the personality and nature that is inherent to them. Only the law, only through the law can this be accomplished, i.e. you put in a really strong set of laws, no matter who's ruling, the laws will handle things. And the laws, of course, are there basically to benefit whoever happens to be the ruler. What is the goal of politics? A strong state. Unlike Confucius, who viewed early kings as passive transmitters, Shang believed the sage's way of organizing a country is not to imitate antiquity, which is what, again, the Confucius wanted to do, or to conform to the immediate present, but to govern in accordance with the important needs of the times, and to make laws that can take customs into account. The second part of the phrase, obviously, is a reference to Taoism. Sovereign's will, carefully codified and impartially applied, is what law is. In other words, there's no rule of law particularly, except whatever the ruler says it is. If he wants to change it tomorrow, he changes it. Things like precedent that we have in Western law, the British law and American law, don't exist. For Shang, the law is the sovereign's will. The sovereign is above the law. They had some arguments of whether he was and whether he's not. Doesn't really matter. In practical terms, they wound up being above the law. The most famous legalist theorist is a fellow by the name of Han Fei-tzu. And he was cynical. And he said only with laws and techniques could they oversee and implement the correct way, whatever that may be. So at any rate, that gives you a feel for this. This is a whole system of philosophy that is basically structured to do what? To satisfy whatever the leader wants. It's really scary. No moral judgments are involved in this thing. This is, we do whatever we got to do. It is basically a recipe for despotism. Now, how do you deal with subordinates? Think Mao Zedong when I talk about this, because Mao systematically, with the exception of Zhou Enlai, who was his number 2 for years, everyone else who was named heir apparent got taken out at some point. Given the propensity of subordinates to pursue their own selfish interests, the ruler cannot afford to be candid or warm towards any of them. Nice philosophy, isn't it? If you were a king and you had a son, who's the enemy? The son, potentially, because the son might want to have your kingship. Lovely. When a ruler trusts someone, he falls under that person's control. So you wind up with someone like Chairman Mao who trusts nobody, with the exception of Zhou Enlai, possibly. But I mean, he just basically, he takes most of his cadre during the Cultural Revolution, sends them all out to the fields for 10 years. Lovely, lovely. And that included wives, children, subordinates. Keep everybody in awed ignorance of your intentions and control them by manipulating competition amongst them. Franklin Roosevelt. That's how he treated his cabinet. Rulers need to be firm but consistent. All right. No room for private conceptions of right and wrong, because diversity leads to weakness. What's right? What's right is whatever furthers the state. There's no moral values there. It makes anything that the ruler does okay, essentially. There's no law above the independent wishes of the rulers, and no limits to their actions. Frankly, it's one of the most authoritarian philosophies I've ever heard of, this legalism. And it is a part and parcel of what has become China over the years. Doesn't always predominate, but it's always there. Okay. And this we don't need to do. Quickly, Buddhism. Buddhism in China. I don't like to say that a major religion of the world is irrelevant, but as compared to the philosophies, it essentially is. Because what it did was it moved into China and basically wrapped itself around these philosophies, particularly Confucianism, and changed from the way it was in India to the Chinese way of being Buddhist. Of course, in India, Hinduism came in, and that was the end of Buddhism for the most part. So at any rate, it's a very, very interesting topic, but most of the Buddhist and Taoist priests tended to stay in their isolated communities, and so it didn't really change society, not the way the philosophies did. And that's basically what I have to say. You see more evidence of Buddhism, frankly, in Taiwan and in other Asian countries than you do in the PRC. It's still a little bit of a tentative thing. The other philosophies are somewhat acceptable in the PRC because they're philosophies, not religions. I think generally communists tend to view religions as being somewhat antithetical to their position. That is basically the first talk today. Next week, it's going to be much more historical, as it will be in the subsequent weeks, political and historical. What I wanted to do, though, is lay in some philosophical basis so that you can understand what follows. And I really don't think you can understand China without understanding these things, because the elements of all of these tend to pop up constantly throughout Chinese history. And they're just things that they're been inculcated into every person in the country from the time they're children. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions. Anybody got a question?
Wonderful job. Very, very informative.
Thank you. I hope that's the idea. Any other questions? All righty. Well, with that, I guess that concludes this week, and I hope to see you all next week. And I thank you very, very much for giving me some of your time.
Thanks, Tom.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Tom. Can I say one thing, Tom? This is Maureen. I forgot to give my commercial for if you are enjoying our classes, please consider making a donation to the foundation because it's allowing us to continue working and doing this while we're social distancing. So thank you. And thank you, Tom. It was a great class.
Thank you. And I hope maybe by the time we do the last one or the one before that we can actually do it in person, which would be kind of nice, but we'll see.
Would be nice.
Not if it's
Thank
dangerous.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Have a very nice day.
You too.
Okay.